When Emily told me about the upcoming corporate retreat, her excitement was contagious. "It's in the mountains," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Team-building exercises, leadership training, and the most beautiful scenery you've ever seen." I could tell this was important to her. She'd been working so hard at the firm, and this retreat sounded like a chance to recharge while impressing the higher-ups. "It's a huge opportunity," she added, her voice a mix of nerves and enthusiasm. As we packed her suitcase together, I couldn't help but feel a little jealous. While she'd be soaking in views of snow-covered peaks and sipping hot cocoa by the fire, I'd be home juggling work, Jasper the cat, and the never-ending battle against the laundry pile. "Don't forget your gloves," I said, tossing them in her bag. "And text me pictures. I want to live vicariously through your adventure." Emily laughed, leaning over to kiss me on the cheek. "You'll be the first to know if anything exciting happens." The first few days passed uneventfully. I went to work, came home to an unusually clingy Jasper, and scrolled through Emily's posts on social media. Her photos were breathtaking. Snow-dusted pines, frozen lakes, and cozy cabins that looked like they were straight out of a travel magazine. One picture caught my eye. Emily standing in front of a roaring bonfire, her cheeks rosy from the cold, holding a mug of what I assumed was hot cider. She looked genuinely happy, radiant, even. I liked the photo but couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen her this carefree in a while. Her captions, though lighthearted, had a polished edge. "The mountains have a way of stealing your worries," one read. Another, "Grateful for this incredible experience with amazing people." Amazing people. Who exactly? She hadn't mentioned much about her coworkers except for the typical office banter. Maybe it was just corporate fluff for the online audience. I didn't think much of it at the time. I sent her a quick text. "Looks like you're having a great time. Don't forget to bring me back one of those mountain chocolates you keep talking about." She replied almost instantly, "Of course. Miss you." Still, I couldn't shake the faint feeling of detachment creeping in. Maybe it was just me being left behind while she embarked on this adventure. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I didn't yet understand. The days blurred together. Emily posted more stunning photos. Snowboarding with her team, group dinners with laughter that practically leaped off the screen, and candid shots of her bundled up against the cold. Each picture painted the retreat as a dream escape. I double-tapped them all, trying not to overthink the growing distance I felt. By the time the weekend arrived, I realized I hadn't heard her voice once. She'd been responding to texts, sure, but there was no warmth in the words. No inside jokes or random, "I miss you" messages like before. I chalked it up to her being busy with work. This retreat wasn't just a vacation, after all. Still, a quiet thought tugged at the back of my mind. Is everything really as perfect as it seems? The week dragged on, each day punctuated by Emily's glowing updates from the mountains. I tried not to let the growing distance bother me, brushing it off as my overactive imagination. But just when I thought I was getting a handle on my feelings, everything took an unexpected turn. It was Thursday evening when my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Greg, a good friend and occasional drinking buddy. Greg wasn't one for small talk, so I assumed he wanted to vent about work or the latest sports controversy. "Hey man," I greeted him casually, putting him on speaker while I folded laundry. Hey," Greg replied, his voice carrying an odd mix of hesitation and urgency. "Listen, I don't know if I should be telling you this, but I think you'd want to know." My stomach tightened. "What's going on?" Greg hesitated for a beat, the kind of pause that makes your mind race with possibilities. "Okay, so, I was up in the mountains earlier today for a meeting, at the hotel near Glenview Peaks. Anyway, I was walking through the lobby, and I saw Emily." My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, she's up there for her company retreat," I said, trying to sound calm even as unease began to creep in. "Why? Did something happen?" Greg cleared his throat. "She looked happy, man. Real happy. She was with a group of people, laughing and all that. But there was this one guy." I froze, the laundry in my hands forgotten. "What about him?" Well, he had his arm around her. They were hugging, and it looked I don't know, kinda close? Like, not just a friendly pat on the back kind of hug. The room seemed to tilt slightly as I processed his words. A hug, I repeated, my voice taut. Yeah. Look, maybe I'm overthinking it, Greg said quickly. It could have been nothing. Maybe they're just good friends or whatever. I just thought you'd want to know. 1,000 questions buzzed in my head, but I couldn't get my mouth to form a single one. Finally, I managed, "Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it." "Yeah, no problem," he said, though his tone suggested he wished he'd never called. "I didn't mean to stir the pot or anything. Just figured you should hear it from me." After we hung up, I sat there staring at the phone, the pile of unfolded laundry forgotten beside me. My mind was a whirlpool of doubt and denial. A hug, a simple hug. People hug all the time. It doesn't mean anything, right? But as much as I wanted to dismiss it, Greg's words lingered like a splinter in my brain. It wasn't just the hug. It was the way he described it, the hesitation in his voice. When Emily texted me later that evening, "Just got back from dinner with the team. Hope your day was good." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Sounds fun. Miss you." Her reply came quickly, a chirpy, "Miss you too," but something about it felt off. I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that Greg's call had cracked open a door I'd been too afraid to look behind. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I told myself it was nothing, just a misunderstanding. Greg didn't know the full context, and Emily had never given me a reason to doubt her. And yet, deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The morning after Greg's call, I woke up feeling restless. It wasn't just the lack of sleep. It was the quiet unease that had settled into my chest, refusing to let go. I kept replaying his words. It could have been nothing, but could it? Emily sent me her usual morning text. "Heading to the workshops now. Have a great day." I stared at the message, trying to detect some hidden meaning in her cheerful tone. I didn't respond right away. For the first time in our relationship, I felt unsure of how to talk to her. Should I confront her about Greg's call? Ask if anything unusual had happened? Or would that just make me look paranoid and controlling? By lunchtime, I couldn't hold back anymore. I called Greg. "Hey," he said, his voice cautious. "Everything okay?" "I've been thinking about what you told me," I admitted, pacing the living room. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw? Every detail." Greg sighed heavily. "Look, man, I don't want to make things worse. Maybe I misread the situation. Just tell me," I pressed. "All right," he said reluctantly. I was waiting in the lobby for my meeting when I saw Emily walk in with a group of people. They looked like coworkers, wearing badges and stuff. She was laughing with this guy, and then he put his arm around her. She leaned into him for a second, and they hugged. It wasn't like overly romantic or anything, but it felt close, you know? Too close for coworkers. I swallowed hard. "Did she see you?" "No. She was too busy talking with him," Greg said. "Look, I'm not trying to stir up trouble. For all I know, it could have been nothing." "Yeah," I murmured, though my mind was already racing. "Thanks for telling me." After we hung up, I sat there staring at the wall, trying to convince myself it really was nothing. But the doubts were like vines, growing and twisting until they were impossible to ignore. That evening, when Emily called, her voice was as bright and bubbly as ever. "How's Jasper? Did he destroy the couch yet?" she joked. "He's behaving. For now," I said, forcing a laugh. She talked about the day's workshops and how her team had a snowball fight during lunch. I tried to focus on her words, but my mind kept drifting back to Greg's description. "Sounds like you're having a lot of fun," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Yeah, it's been amazing," she said. "I can't wait to show you all the pictures." I almost asked about the guy Greg mentioned. The words were right there on the tip of my tongue. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of hearing the wrong answer. Or maybe it was the flicker of hope that Greg was wrong. That this whole thing was just a misunderstanding. When we hung up, I sat in silence, staring at my phone. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust her completely, the way I always had. But the seeds of doubt had already taken root. That night, I scrolled through her social media, analyzing every photo and caption like a detective searching for clues. The images were picturesque. Team dinners, snowy landscapes, her radiant smile. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, there was one photo that caught my attention. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. A candid shot of Emily laughing at something off camera. Her cheeks flushed. The caption read, "Laughter really is the best medicine." I stared at the picture, wondering who had made her laugh like that. Was it the same guy Greg had seen? Sleep didn't come easily that night. My mind was a whirlwind of questions, none of which I had answers to. The days following Greg's call were an emotional tug-of-war. Part of me wanted to confront Emily directly, to demand answers and settle my growing unease. But the other part, the cautious, self-preserving part, held me back. What if Greg was wrong? What if I ruined something beautiful just because I let a sliver of doubt fester? Still, the unease was relentless. Every time Emily texted or called, her words seemed perfectly normal, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing, or hidden. Then, on Friday evening, as I scrolled absent-mindedly through social media, I got another message, this time from Sarah, a mutual friend of ours. "Hey, just saw this and thought you'd want to know," she wrote, attaching a screenshot. My heart stopped when I opened it. The image was a candid photo, posted by one of Emily's co-workers. It showed a group of people seated around a table at what looked like a rustic lodge bar. Emily was there, smiling with a drink in her hand, and beside her was a man I didn't recognize. Leaning in close, his arm draped casually across the back of her chair. The caption read, "Great times with the best team ever. Hashtag corporate retreat, hashtag work hard, play hard." I stared at the photo, my stomach twisting into knots. Was this the same guy Greg had seen? It had to be. There was an ease in his posture, a familiarity in the way he leaned toward her, that set my nerves on edge. I didn't reply to Sarah right away. Instead, I saved the photo and zoomed in on Emily's face. She looked happy, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. But was it the kind of happy you feel with friends or the kind you feel with someone else? Later that evening, when Emily called, I couldn't hide the edge in my voice. "How's it going up there?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "Busy but fun," she said. "We had a big group dinner tonight. Everyone's really getting to know each other." "Sounds nice," I said, trying not to overthink her words. "Who'd you sit with?" There was a pause, just a fraction of a second, but long enough to make my pulse quicken. "Mostly the usual group," she said lightly. "You know, Karen, Lily, some of the guys from marketing." "Anyone I've met before?" "Probably not," she said quickly. "It's mostly work people." Her answers were perfectly reasonable, but something about her tone felt off, like she was carefully choosing her words. I wanted to ask about the man in the photo, to ask who he was and why he seemed so comfortable with her. But I couldn't bring myself to say the words. Instead, I let the conversation drift to safer topics. Jasper's antics, the weather, the book she'd been meaning to read. When we hung up, I sat in the quiet of our living room, staring at my phone. The screenshot from Sarah burned a hole in my mind. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the guy was just a friendly coworker. But then again, maybe he wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photo. Emily laughing, her chair just a little too close to his. By the time the sun came up, I'd made a decision. If there was nothing to hide, then I'd have nothing to find. But if there was something more, I had to know. The morning after another sleepless night, I felt like a shadow of myself. Emily's words from the previous evening replayed in my mind, each one carefully measured, each one feeling scripted. I couldn't go on like this. The uncertainty was eating away at me, and I needed answers. Not guesses, not reassurances, but hard truths. After staring blankly at my phone for what felt like hours, I made a decision. I called Greg. "Hey, it's me again," I said, my voice weary. "Hey man, you okay?" Greg sounded cautious, maybe even a little guilty, like he was regretting the phone call that had planted this seed of doubt in the first place. "I need a favor," I said. "I need to know more about what you saw." "More?" he asked, hesitating. "Look, I don't want to make things worse. Greg, please," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I expected. "You're the only one I can trust to tell me the truth. Can you describe him? The guy you saw with her?" He sighed heavily. "All right, he was about your height, maybe a little taller. Brown hair, clean-shaven, wearing one of those stupid puffy vests everyone's obsessed with." I swallowed hard. "Anything else?" Greg paused, as if debating whether to say more. "They looked comfortable together, like they knew each other well." That word, comfortable, sent a cold shiver down my spine. After we hung up, I sat motionless for several minutes, trying to process everything. It was one thing to hear Greg's words, but seeing that photo from Sarah had cemented something I couldn't ignore. I spent the rest of the morning scrolling through Emily's social media again, looking for any mention of the retreat. It was all the same. A perfect mix of professionalism and casual fun, with no sign of anything suspicious. But then I had a thought. I opened her Instagram and searched the hashtag from the photo Sarah had sent me. #corporate-retreat. Hundreds of posts popped up, most from strangers at unrelated events. But after scrolling for a few minutes, I found another photo posted by one of Emily's co-workers. It was a group shot taken in what looked like a cozy lodge. And there he was, the same man Greg had described, standing next to Emily with his arm around her shoulders. She was smiling brightly, leaning into him just slightly. My heart pounded as I stared at the image, zooming in as if that would somehow change what I was seeing. Was I overreacting? Could this just be harmless coworker camaraderie? The logical part of me wanted to believe that, but the part of me that had spent sleepless nights piecing together every little clue screamed otherwise. I needed to do something. Anything. That's when I decided to take the next step. It felt drastic, even invasive, but I convinced myself it was necessary. While Emily was hundreds of miles away, I took her spare car key from the kitchen drawer and went to her car. My hands trembled as I installed the GPS tracker under the driver's seat. It was a simple device, something I'd bought on a whim a few years ago for long road trips. At the time, I'd never imagined I'd be using it for something like this. As I stepped back into the house, my heart raced with a mix of guilt and resolve. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but if there was nothing to find, then I'd know for sure. And if there was something, well, I'd be ready. That evening, Emily called me as usual. Her voice was warm, tinged with exhaustion, as she recounted another busy day of workshops and team-building exercises. "Sorry I didn't text much earlier," she said. "The schedule's been non-stop. I barely had time to breathe today." "It's fine," I replied, my voice steady but distant. "Sounds like you're working hard." "I am," she said, laughing lightly. "But it's worth it. I feel like I'm finally making the kind of connections that matter." Connections. That word stung in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I wanted to ask what kind of connections she was talking about, but I bit my tongue. When she finally returned home the next day, her arrival was marked by an energy that felt almost foreign to me. She swept into the house, her suitcase trailing behind her, and wrapped me in a quick, perfunctory hug. "Home sweet home," she declared, kicking off her shoes and tossing her bag onto the couch. "Good to have you back," I said, smiling faintly as Jasper darted into the room to rub against her legs. She looked radiant, her cheeks glowing, her eyes bright. It was the kind of happiness I hadn't seen in her for a while, and it should have made me feel good, but it didn't. "How was it?" I asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Unbelievable," she said, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "The workshops were amazing, and the team, wow, what a group. Everyone was so supportive, so fun. I've never felt so inspired." She launched into a story about one of the exercises they'd done, a blindfolded trust walk through the snowy woods. I nodded along, trying to focus on her words, but my mind was elsewhere. "Sounds like a great time," I said when she paused to take a breath. "It really was," she said, smiling. Then her tone softened. I missed you, though. It wasn't the same without you. Her words should have reassured me, but they felt hollow, like something she thought she was supposed to say. As the evening wore on, she unpacked her suitcase and showed me a few souvenirs she'd picked up. A box of chocolates, a snow globe, and a handmade scarf from a local vendor. Thought you'd like this, she said, handing me the scarf. Thanks, I said, forcing a smile. But as we sat down for dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Off. Her stories were detailed and vivid, but they seemed too perfect, too polished. Did you get along with everyone? I asked casually, hoping to steer the conversation toward what I really wanted to know. Yeah, she said. The whole team was great. It's amazing how much you can bond with people in such a short time. And how about the guy in the photo? I added, trying to keep my tone light. She blinked, her fork hovering mid-air. What guy? I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. The one in that group picture Sarah sent me. Looked like he was sitting next to you. Oh, she said quickly, her voice a touch too high. That's Mark. He's in marketing. Super nice guy, always cracking jokes. Her answer came easily, but there was a slight tension in her shoulders, a flicker of something in her eyes that made me pause. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but my mind was racing. When she kissed me goodnight and went to bed, I stayed up, sitting in the quiet of the living room with a cup of coffee. I replayed our conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every hesitation. Was I reading too much into things? Or was there really something she wasn't telling me? By the time the clock struck midnight, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this doubt consume me. I needed clarity, real, undeniable clarity. The next morning, after Emily left for work, I waited until the coast was clear. Then, with my heart pounding, I took the spare key from the kitchen drawer and went to her car. The tracker wasn't much. A small, discreet device I'd bought a few years ago. It slid easily under the driver's seat, hidden from view but perfectly positioned to do its job. I stepped back, wiping my hands on my jeans, and stared at the car for a moment. What I was doing felt wrong, an invasion of privacy I never thought I'd resort to. But the alternative, living in a constant state of doubt, felt worse. As I walked back into the house, I told myself this was the only way. If Emily had nothing to hide, then the tracker would prove it. And if there was something, I needed to know. The tracker blinked to life almost immediately, a faint red on my laptop screen marking Emily's car as it idled in our driveway. I stared at the map, a mix of guilt and grim determination churning in my gut. I wasn't proud of this, but I needed answers. Answers I couldn't seem to get any other way. When Emily returned home that evening, she was as cheerful as ever, chatting about her day and how she'd finally caught up on emails after the retreat. Feels good to be back in the swing of things, she said, kicking off her heels by the door. Yeah, I replied, distracted. I couldn't focus on her words. My mind kept circling back to the blinking dot on my screen, a silent witness to wherever she'd been. The first few days passed without incident. Her movements were predictable. Home to work, work to the gym, the occasional stop at the grocery store. I felt a small sense of relief with every update, telling myself I'd been overthinking things. But then, on Thursday evening, something changed. Emily had told me she'd be working late, finishing up a project that had apparently fallen behind while she was at the retreat. I'd nodded, hiding my unease, and wished her luck. At first, the tracker reflected her usual routine: work, a quick trip to a nearby cafe, back to the office. I was ready to close the laptop and call it a night when the dot started moving again. I frowned, watching as it left the office parking lot and took a route I didn't recognize. The dot stopped at a location I'd never seen before, a suburban neighborhood on the other side of town. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. "What are you doing there, Emily?" I murmured under my breath. I pulled up the address on Google Maps. It was a residential area, the kind of place with tree-lined streets and cozy-looking houses. Definitely not an office, and not a place she'd ever mentioned visiting. The dot stayed there for nearly an hour. My imagination ran wild, conjuring scenarios I didn't want to believe. Was it a client meeting? A friend's house? Or something else? When Emily finally came home that night, she was calm, composed, her usual self. "Long day," she said with a tired smile. "But I think we finally got everything sorted. How was your evening?" "Fine," I said, keeping my tone even. "Just the usual." She kissed me lightly on the cheek before heading upstairs to shower. I followed her with my eyes, trying to reconcile the woman I knew, the woman I'd built a life with the mystery forming in my mind. Later, as we lay in bed, I couldn't help but ask, "Where were you working tonight?" She murmured, her voice heavy with sleep. "Your meeting," I pressed gently. "Where was it?" She shifted slightly, her eyes still closed. "Just at the office." "Why?" Her answer was so smooth, so confident, that for a moment, I doubted what I'd seen. But only for a moment. As Emily drifted off, I stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning with questions. Why had she lied? And more importantly, what was she hiding? The next day, I monitored the tracker more closely than ever. I felt like a detective chasing down a lead, my every move tinged with anticipation and dread. That evening, she told me she'd be meeting a friend for dinner. "Who?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Lily," she said, naming a coworker I'd met once or twice. "We haven't caught up in forever." "Have fun," I said, watching as she grabbed her purse and headed out the door. As soon as she was gone, I opened my laptop. The dot moved predictably at first, toward a restaurant downtown. But then, just like before, it changed course. This time, it stopped at an apartment building in a part of town we never visited. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I waited for over 2 hours, refreshing the map every few minutes, hoping for some explanation that would make sense. None came. When Emily finally returned home, she was glowing, her smile easy and relaxed. "How was dinner?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Great," she said. "We spent half the time laughing about the retreat. You'd love some of Lily's stories." I forced a smile. "Maybe you can tell me later." Inside, though, I was unraveling. I had proof now, proof that something wasn't adding up. And while part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, another part of me knew I wasn't ready. Not yet. The morning after Emily's so-called dinner with Lily, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. Every detail of the previous night replayed in my mind. Her effortless smile, the way she'd brushed off my questions, and most of all, the tracker's blinking red. Sitting outside that unfamiliar apartment building, I needed answers. While Emily went about her usual morning routine, humming softly as she got ready for work, I opened my laptop and pulled up the tracker's data. It confirmed what I already knew. She had spent over 2 hours parked at that address, far away from any restaurant. The thought made my chest tighten. "Big plans for today?" I asked casually as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Just the usual," she replied. "Meetings, emails, and maybe a gym session after work. Nothing too exciting." Her words were calm, matter of fact. If she was hiding something, she wasn't letting it show. "Maybe we can grab dinner together tonight?" I suggested, testing the waters. She hesitated just for a moment. "Oh, I'd love to, but I might run late again. This project is taking forever to wrap up." I nodded, forcing a smile. "No problem. Maybe tomorrow." She kissed me on the cheek and headed out the door, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As soon as she was gone, I pulled up the tracker again. Her car was en route to her office, just as she'd said. For the next several hours, I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to the blinking dot on my screen. Around 5:30 p.m., the tracker showed her leaving the office. I waited, heart pounding, as it followed her route. The gym. She stayed there for about an hour, long enough to seem legitimate. Then the dot started moving again, this time toward a part of town I recognized all too well. The apartment building. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen. Why was she going back there? What reason could she possibly have for visiting the same place twice in 2 days? I couldn't just sit and watch this time. I had to see for myself. It was a short drive across town, but it felt like an eternity. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing with possibilities. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. By the time I parked a block away from the apartment, my heart was pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Her car was there, parked neatly in front of the building. I stayed in my car, watching from a distance, waiting for something, anything, that would explain why she was here. About 15 minutes later, the door to the building opened, and my breath caught in my throat. Emily stepped out, smiling, her cheeks flushed. She was walking alongside a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with an easy confidence about him, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged in an outdoor clothing ad. As they approached her car, he said something that made her laugh. A laugh that felt like a dagger to my chest. They stood there for a moment, talking, before he leaned in and hugged her. It wasn't a quick, casual hug. It was the kind of embrace that lingered, that said more than words ever could. I felt my grip on the steering wheel tighten until my knuckles turned white. When Emily finally got into her car and drove away, I stayed parked, my mind reeling. Who was he? Why hadn't she told me about him? And most of all, what had they been doing in that apartment for over an hour? By the time I got home, Emily was already there, curled up on the couch with Jasper, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. "Hey," she said brightly as I walked in. "How was your day?" "Fine," I replied, my voice carefully neutral. "Yours?" "Busy as usual," she said with a shrug. "Nothing exciting." I stood there for a moment, staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I'd seen laughing with that stranger. "I ran into Greg today," I lied, testing her reaction. "Oh?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "How's he doing?" "Good," I said. "He mentioned he saw you at the retreat." Her expression didn't falter. "Yeah, he texted me afterward." "Small world." "Huh. Yeah," I said slowly. "Small world." I waited for her to say more, to offer some kind of explanation that would make everything make sense. But she didn't. Later that night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what I'd seen pressed heavily on my chest. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more. But one thing was clear. Whatever was happening, it wasn't nothing. The moment had come. I didn't know how or when, but something inside me snapped. The weight of suspicion, the sleepless nights, the endless mental gymnastics to justify what I was seeing. It all became too much. I needed answers, and I was going to get them, even if it broke me. It was Tuesday evening when Emily told me she'd be staying late at work again. "It's crunch time for this project," she said with a weary smile. "The team's putting in extra hours to make sure everything's perfect." I nodded, masking the storm brewing inside me. "Want me to bring you some coffee later? Keep you going?" "Oh, that's sweet," she replied, her smile softening. "But don't worry, I've got plenty of caffeine in the break room. You just relax tonight." I nodded again, forcing a smile, but the knot in my stomach tightened. I couldn't take another vague excuse, another half-hearted reassurance. I needed to see for myself. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed. The drive to her office felt surreal, the kind of moment where time stretches and compresses all at once. My mind was racing, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I rehearsed a dozen possible scenarios. What would I find? A late-night brainstorming session? A team reviewing presentations over pizza? Or something far worse? When I arrived, the office building loomed dark and quiet, save for a few scattered lights glowing on the upper floors. I parked a block away and walked, the chill of the evening air doing little to calm my nerves. As I entered the lobby, the security guard barely glanced at me. "Here for Emily?" I mumbled, keeping my head down. He nodded, waving me through. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt like an eternity, each ding amplifying the pounding of my heart. When the doors finally slid open, I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the carpet. The office was eerily silent. No laughter, no conversations, no clatter of keyboards. just the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Maybe she's in the conference room, I whispered to myself, clinging to the hope that I was wrong. I walked toward her office, my pulse quickening with each step. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. And then I heard it. A low murmur of voices, punctuated by soft laughter. I crept closer, every fiber of my being screaming at me to stop, to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. What I saw when I pushed the door open froze me in place. There they were, Emily and her boss, half-dressed, locked in a passionate embrace. Her blouse was unbuttoned. His tie hung loose around his neck, and their lips were pressed together in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The room spun around me as I tried to process the scene. My legs felt like they'd turned to stone, rooting me to the spot. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. It was as if time had stopped, leaving me suspended in that agonizing moment. Emily's hand slid up his chest, her fingers curling into his shirt as she pulled him closer. His hand rested on the small of her back, guiding her against him with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. And then she laughed. That same laugh I'd heard on the phone. So carefree, so full of life. It was the sound that broke me. "Emily," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They didn't hear me. "Emily," I shouted, my voice cracking with the force of my anguish. The sound startled them apart, their heads snapping toward me. Emily's eyes went wide, her face draining of color as she clutched her blouse, fumbling to cover herself. Wait, I can explain," she stammered, her voice trembling. Her boss, that smug, arrogant bastard, didn't even flinch. He straightened his tie, a cocky smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he found the whole situation amusing. "Hey, buddy," he said, his tone maddeningly calm. "This isn't what it looks like." Couldn't take it. The rage, the betrayal, the humiliation. It all erupted at once. "Don't you dare call me buddy," I spat, my voice shaking with fury. "You think I'm blind? You think I don't see what's going on here?" "Please," Emily pleaded, stepping toward me, her eyes glistening with tears. "It's not what you think." Not what I think," I roared, cutting her off. "I've been driving myself insane trying to believe you, trying to trust you, and this is what you've been doing." Her lip quivered, but she didn't respond. I turned to her boss, my fists clenched at my sides. "You," I snarled, "you couldn't find someone else to ruin? You had to come after my wife." He shrugged, his smirk infuriatingly intact. "Look, man, I think we should all just calm down." "Calm down," I shouted, my voice echoing through the office. "You don't get to tell me to calm down. Not after this." I turned back to Emily, my voice breaking. "How could you do this to me? To us? After everything we've been through?" Tears streamed down her face, but she said nothing. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavily in the air. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I turned and walked away. "Wait," Emily called after me, her voice desperate. But I didn't stop. Couldn't. As I stepped into the elevator, my heart shattered into a million pieces. I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The elevator ride down felt endless. My reflection in the polished metal walls stared back at me, hollow-eyed, trembling, and utterly shattered. My mind raced in chaotic circles, replaying the scene in excruciating detail. Emily's blouse undone, her boss's smug smirk, the way she looked at him with a familiarity I hadn't seen in years. I stumbled out of the building into the cool night air, the sharp wind biting at my face. It felt like the world was moving on around me. Cars honking, people laughing, life continuing, while mine had just come to a screeching halt. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me out of my haze. It was Emily. I stared at the screen, her name glowing like a brand against my palm. For a moment, I considered answering, demanding an explanation, or screaming into the receiver. But what could she possibly say that would make any of this better? I let it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again, and again, and again. Finally, I answered, my voice cold and clipped. What? Please let me explain, Emily begged, her voice thick with tears. Explain, I said, my tone icy. What could you possibly say that would change what I just saw? It's not what you think. Don't, I roared, cutting her off. Don't insult me by pretending this was some innocent misunderstanding. I saw you, Emily. I saw everything. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, broken only by the sound of her muffled sobs. I didn't mean for this to happen. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to my own ears. Didn't mean for this to happen? You didn't mean to unbutton your blouse? Didn't mean to kiss him? Or didn't mean to destroy everything we've built together? Please, she pleaded. Come home. Let's talk about this. Face to face. Home. I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Do you even know what that word means anymore? I love you, she said desperately. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I love you. I couldn't listen anymore. Without another word, I ended the call and threw my phone onto the passenger seat of my car. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city blurring into an endless stream of lights and shadows. Every red light felt like a punishment, forcing me to sit with my thoughts, to relive that horrific moment over and over again. By the time I pulled into our driveway, it was well past midnight. The house loomed before me, dark and silent, like a monument to everything I just lost. I didn't want to go inside, but I had nowhere else to go. When I opened the door, I was met with the faint sound of muffled crying. Emily was sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I stared at her, the woman I had once trusted with everything, now a stranger sitting in my living room. How long? I asked, my voice low and trembling. What? How long? She hesitated, her lips trembling as she searched for the right words. It's been a few months. Her admission hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the air leave my lungs, my knees threatening to give out beneath me. Months? I repeated, the word bitter and venomous. You've been lying to me for months? It wasn't supposed to happen, she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. I didn't plan this. It just happened. Just happened? I echoed, shaking my head in disbelief. People don't just fall into their boss's arms, Emily. You made a choice. Every single time you chose him. Her tears came harder now, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed into her hands. But I felt no sympathy, no urge to comfort her. What was I to you? I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of my anguish. A placeholder? A backup plan? Or just an idiot who wouldn't notice? You're my husband, she said, her voice barely audible. I love you. I never stopped loving you. Don't you dare say that. I spat, my voice rising. You don't get to throw that word around like it means something. Love doesn't do this, Emily. Love doesn't betray. Love doesn't destroy. I didn't want to hurt you, she whispered, her words trembling. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You failed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily sat there, her face buried in her hands, while I stood frozen, my fists clenched at my sides. Finally, I turned toward the stairs. What are you doing? She asked, her voice panicked. Packing, I said curtly. Please don't do this, she begged, standing up and moving toward me. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, talk to someone, anything. Just don't leave. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned to face her, my expression cold and unyielding. You didn't just break my heart, Emily. You broke my trust, my respect, and everything we built together. And I don't think I can ever get that back. Her sobs echoed through the house as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. That night, I packed a bag and left. As I drove away from the house that had once been my sanctuary, I felt a strange mix of pain and liberation. This wasn't the end I'd imagined, but it was the one I had to face. I don't remember much of the drive that night. The roads were dark and empty, a blur of streetlights and shadows as I left behind the house, the memories, and the life I'd built with Emily. It felt like I was running, fleeing from the wreckage of my world, even though I had nowhere to go. The first stop was a motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, peeling wallpaper, a flickering neon sign outside the window, but it was quiet, and most importantly, it wasn't home. I threw my bag onto the bed and sank into a chair by the window, staring out into the night. For hours, I sat there, replaying the events of the past few days in my head. Emily's laughter at the office, the look on her face when she saw me standing there, the smug expression on her boss's face as if he had nothing to lose. The anger bubbled up again, a volcanic rage that threatened to consume me. But beneath it was something worse. Heartbreak. The kind of pain that made it hard to breathe, that clawed at your chest and left you hollow. I grabbed my phone, instinctively scrolling through old photos of us. There we were at the beach, smiling with sunburned noses. At our anniversary dinner, clinking glasses. On the couch, Jasper wedged between us as she kissed my cheek. I couldn't look anymore. I threw the phone onto the bed, the screen going dark, and buried my face in my hands. The next morning, I called my parents. "Hey, Dad," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Son, what's wrong?" he asked immediately, the concern in his voice like a lifeline. I left," I said simply. "Emily and we're done." There was a pause on the other end, heavy with unspoken understanding. "Do you need a place to stay?" he asked gently. "No, I'm okay. I needed to tell someone." For the next hour, I poured my heart out, telling him everything. Greg's call, the tracker, the confrontation at the office. He listened patiently, offering quiet reassurances but never interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I'm proud of you, son, for standing up for yourself, for not letting this break you." I didn't feel proud. I felt broken. But his words gave me a sliver of strength I didn't know I had. The days that followed were a blur of logistics. I met with a divorce lawyer, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and a steely determination that made me feel like I had an ally in my corner. "Do you want to go after anything specific?" she asked, flipping through her notes. "No," I said firmly. "I just want it to be over. She can have the house. I don't care." She nodded, her pen scratching against the paper. "Fair enough. But make sure you get what's rightfully yours. Don't let guilt cloud your judgment." Emily tried to reach out several times in the following weeks. At first, it was tearful voicemails and long text messages filled with apologies and promises to change. "I made a mistake," one message read, "but it doesn't have to define us. Please, let's fix this together." I didn't respond. Then the tone shifted. Her messages became sharper, angrier. "You're throwing away everything we've built. Is that what you want? To walk away without even trying?" Still, I stayed silent. Finally, she stopped trying. It wasn't easy. The first few weeks were a haze of grief and anger, my emotions swinging wildly between heartbreak and rage. But slowly, I started to find moments of clarity. I reconnected with old friends, the kind who didn't ask too many questions but knew how to be there when you needed them. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind occupied. And then there was Jasper. The little furball seemed to sense my pain, curling up beside me every night, his soft purring a small comfort in the darkness. One evening, about a month after I left, I found myself sitting in the same motel room, staring at the packed bag by the door. I realized I didn't need to stay here anymore. This wasn't my life, it was just a temporary pause. The next morning, I checked out and moved into a small apartment downtown. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The divorce was finalized quietly, with no dramatic courtroom battles or bitter arguments. Emily got the house, just as I'd said, and I walked away with a clean slate. As I signed the final papers, my lawyer looked at me and said, "This is the end of one chapter, but it's also the beginning of another. Don't forget that. She was right. That night, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, looking out at the city lights. The pain was still there, a dull ache that would take time to heal. But for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. Emily had made her choices, and I had made mine. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine now, and I was ready to start living it. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.